Good evening and welcome to the Alex Thomas Talk Show, and thank you for tuning in. Today I have a very interesting topic and I'm excited to talk about it because there's a lot of misinformation and a lot of misunderstanding about it. What we are going to talk about is the Masterpiece Cake Shop versus the Colorado Civil Rights Commission Supreme Court decision. And who I'm going to talk about it with is our guest from last week, and in case you didn't know, I'm going to let him in case you didn't see it last week, I'm going to let him introduce himself. Stephen Fuller, thanks for coming.
Hi. So, thanks for having me, Alex. So, I am an exhibiting artist here at the gallery for Pride Month, and also follow cases in the news that are relevant to LGBT people, or GSRM, as some would say, gender, sexuality, and romantic minorities.
Okay.
You know, catch-all that we use.
Excuse me for a second. Last week, we had Dee on, and I was using LGBTQ, and then there was another acronym afterwards, and I thought it was I, and I didn't get a chance to get that explained. Do you recall what that?
I think that was LGBTT. QQIAAPP, which is why I like GSRM so much better, because it encompasses all of that.
Okay. I think it's important because this would be really educational for a lot of people, because can you give us the difference or give us what the each acronym stands for?
So they start out actually as G and L, gay and lesbian, and then the B was added for bisexual, and then eventually the T for transgender, which is not just one thing, it actually encompasses a great many things. So that one in itself is kind of a catch-all. And at some point, instead of GLBT, they reversed it to become LGBT to recognize the role the lesbians had in taking care of gay men during the AIDS crisis. They stepped in to help out with that because our community was so devastated. And so that's the LGBT part. The Q part can be for people who identify as queer. And then there's also a Q for questioning. People who just aren't quite sure where they are with their orientation or their romantic feelings.
I'm glad, because I was confident that I LGBTQ, but I didn't know about the change because of the lesbian community helping out the AIDS patient in the HIV positive community. So thanks for enlightening me. But go ahead.
So we have LGBTQQ. I would be for intersex. I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of intersex, but it would be people who are born with their physical appearance isn't necessarily quite male or quite female. And this can also cover quite a host of different things.
It's
intersex.
Intersex, would it be, and excuse me if it isn't a correct term, but hermaphrodite, is that?
We don't use hermaphrodite anymore. It's actually considered somewhat of a slur. And it's also inaccurate because the term hermaphrodite really would mean someone who is half male and half female. And that really isn't applicable in the case of intersex.
So it really never was a correct term anyway, besides being a current term now. Thanks for excuse me. So
not an application to humans anyway.
Okay. In the popular concept now, because I'm sure there's a lot of people that don't know that it's a slur. So would intersex be, or what are some
people who choose to identify that they are in this group would probably use intersex.
Okay. Yeah. So that's okay.
So we have,
I'll try to stop
the I.
Okay.
No, that's fine.
Okay.
It's very informative. We have A for would be asexual and possibly aromantic. Sometimes people have used the A to also designate allies of these communities who aren't necessarily part of them, but do support the cause for their rights. So that gets us through the A's. Oh, I said there were 2 T's. One for transgender. I think the other one is for transvestite, if I'm correct. And I'm not positive about that one. People who just cross-dress but don't necessarily identify as having a gender identity different than the sex they were assigned at birth. So we have a P for pansexual, and then another P for polyamorous.
Pansexual.
They basically are attracted to anyone and everyone.
All right.
More or less. I think more the distinction is they don't necessarily distinguish between someone who's transgender versus someone who's cisgender. They don't distinguish in their affection between men and women.
Okay. And then after.
And I'm sure people will let us know if I'm getting this wrong.
Yeah, please do in the comments.
Please do, because I'm trying to be helpful rather than insult anybody.
Polyamorous, I'm guessing, love a lot of different people.
Polyamorous.
Polyamorous, excuse me.
Yeah, certainly people who would see themselves in a configuration of more than just 2 people, so not monogamous.
God, yes.
I actually knew some people who were basically a trio. And so they would fit under that polyamorous label. And then there's also 2S, which would be two-spirit, and that's actually comes from Native Americans, who that was the designation that they gave to people who maybe weren't identifying really as one sex or the other, or maybe their feelings of affection didn't comport with what was the norm. And in the Native American community, very often these people are considered very special. So,
I think we understand or find out what's the common usage or what we're familiar with through our regular life experience. And if we don't come in contact with a lot of people that are conscious and identify those different genders or identities that you just went through, we're not familiar. So I like to give this format to educate about that. But for other people that aren't don't get opportunity to see the Alex Thomas Show, what's a good source? Because I think of like when Facebook came out and listed all the different genders, there was so many different so much talk, and I think a lot of disrespectful talk and a lot of just not taking it serious. So someone wanting to be respectful and genuinely interested, like what's some good resources to find out that just like what's common, what's appropriate, because we hear so many different things,
The one that kind of comes to mind for me might be something like the Spectrum Center that's associated with the University of Michigan, because they probably would have some information that would be beneficial for people who want to become more aware of the various identities, because they cover the full spectrum, and that's kind of what the idea is between the name Spectrum. So, and then the other term that I mentioned, GSRM, gender, sexual, and romantic minorities, is just a catch-all that covers all of this. And there's some controversy kind of both ways, because people have started using this LGBT as a shortcut, and I am not an LBGT, I am a gay man. So I am part of that LGBT, what's the word I want? A group of separate communities that have come together to form one community. And so it's important that people understand that we aren't just kind of all this one thing. We are united in the common causes that we have, but we also have issues that are specific to our own communities.
We refer to the LGBTQ community, it's an aggregate.
Yeah.
It's not just one monolithic whole.
And was originally a political coalition. to put forward our rights to those causes. So.
All right, thanks. I just think it's so important because I learned a lot right there. But I do want to talk about the Supreme Court decision, Masterpiece Bake Shop versus the Colorado Civil Rights Commission. And in my introduction, I did say that there was a lot of confusion and such, or a lot of misconceptions. Yeah. Would you say that's accurate?
Yes, I certainly would. Yes.
So I'll let you. You're our expert on this today.
So I do have a disclaimer to make. I am not really a legal expert. I do not hold a law degree, and any opinions I express, I have to say, are my own. They don't represent those of any other entity that has an interest in the law. So that we get that out of the way. And I also want to preface this with a statement that I am not anti-religion. I don't really necessarily want to talk about my personal beliefs, but I do have many family and friends who have different faiths, and I certainly respect their right to hold those beliefs. And so I want to be clear that I'm not anti-religion.
Okay, I think everybody's got it. Yeah.
Sometimes when we talk about these conflicts, people get that idea that, oh, you're just anti-all religion, and I'm really not. I really support people's First Amendment rights to believe and worship how they feel. What I do not support is the exploitation of religion for political purposes. That one really gets my dander up.
It gets my dander up also, Stephen. And also just religious bullying. Yeah. And in the sense that I am definitely not anti-religion, but with anybody on an individual basis, I just ask that you respect my beliefs as much as you want me to respect yours.
Exactly.
And sometimes that doesn't happen. Yeah. Okay. But given all those, so why don't you tell what the case was? Yeah. The Masterpiece Bake Shop versus Colorado Civil Rights Commission.
So what this case is there was a same-sex couple that approached a bakery, the Masterpiece Cake Shop, and asked them to make a cake for their wedding. Now, they actually got married in Massachusetts, but then wanted to celebrate and have a wedding reception for their family and friends back in Colorado. The reason they did that was because at the time, it was before the Supreme Court decision in Obergefell that made marriage recognition equal for same-sex couples nationwide. Okay. And so they went to Massachusetts to be married where it was legally recognized, and then came back to Colorado for that reception. So they went to the bakery. They came in and told the proprietor that they wanted to have a cake made to celebrate their wedding. And before there was any conversation about what form the cake would take, he just immediately refused them and said that because of his religious beliefs that he would not make a cake for any same-sex weddings. And this couple are not the only ones who have been refused. In the course of them doing discovery in this case, it's been found that there have been couples who he has also refused on this basis. So I'm really torn about this case because as an artist, I wouldn't want to make something if someone requested something that I found really offensive. I feel like that would be an infringement of my free speech rights, that I would be being compelled to speak in a way that I don't want to.
It's kind of impossible to do your best work if you're really do your work. You really can't create if it's not coming from that spot sincerely.
But also I recognize that, like, once I create something, and if somebody buys that from me, they take ownership of it. I don't really have any control over how they display it, where they display it, that kind of thing. They own the piece. Now, I still have intellectual property rights, so they can't copy it and start selling it themselves. But apart from that, I just don't really have any control over their use of the piece. So that's kind of where my thought process is when I approach this case. It was a very narrow ruling. We did not address the conflict between fundamental religious rights, freedom of religion, versus the statutory, we would call them rights.
And if I could
Things
add,
that come from anti-discrimination law.
and correct me if I'm wrong, didn't when the baker filed suit, he lost in how many other lower courts until the Supreme Court?
So this originally went through the Colorado Civil Rights Commission, which is the entity that he did sue, and they ruled against him. I'm not sure if that went through another step. I think it did, and I just can't quite remember if there was a second group that also went against him. And then it went to an administrative law judge who also ruled against him. And I think from there, then it was appealed to the Supreme Court.
Okay, so not a federal, but well, anyway,
Yeah.
he lost a couple of times. So but the Supreme Court ruled in his favor, and again in a narrow way. And I'll let you explain what that narrow ruling was and what we mean by that.
Yeah. So what people were looking for this case to do was to just definitely say whether people can use their religion as a reason to discriminate against certain groups of people. If that would,
Because that was the basis for his objection.
Yeah.
His religious
if
objection.
this First Amendment right would trump anti-discrimination statutes. And the court didn't do that. They kind of kicked that can down the road for another day. What they did rule was that because of some things that the commission said to him, that they didn't feel that he was given a fair hearing by the commission. They felt that the commission disparaged his religion with some statements that they made. I happen to think that the court got this very wrong in that case. If you read the things the commission said to him, what they were pushing against was the use of religion to justify all kinds of terrible things. They weren't necessarily saying his religious beliefs were terrible or disparaging his religion. And it's a very fine line. But because of the things they said and the strong wording that they used, the court felt that he didn't get a fair hearing. So this is really what the crux of that decision is.
So it was really a due process ruling that he didn't receive fair due process because,
Right.
and correct me if I'm wrong, but then did they cite? I didn't get a chance to read the complete opinion, but didn't they cite other bakers that had given some kinds of objections, but they weren't targeted or they weren't dealt with or
Right.
or what did I?
So there was another man whose last name was Jack, and he approached several bakeries and asked them to make cakes in the form of something that represented an open Bible. Some of them had Bible verses on them. But they also included the image of a same-sex couple with a big X through it. And these other bakers refused to make that because they felt that would be compelling them to speak in a way that they found offensive. And so 3 bakeries refused him, and he sued all 3. His claims were denied as well by this same commission.
And that was cited in the Supreme Court decision as an example of the baker of this particular. Did he give it? It's Masterpiece Bakery or
Masterpiece Bakery, Jack Phillips.
Yeah,
was the proprietor of that establishment.
But why they ruled that his due process rights? Well, do they use the language due process?
I don't know that they actually use the language due process in the ruling, but it is something of that nature where he did not get a fair hearing. They felt that the commission was not neutral with regard to his religious beliefs, which is really what the law would require. And so they felt he was discriminated against on the basis of his religion. And one of the things that they said was that, well, there were these 3 other bakers that were approached by this other man, and their claims were denied. And we think this is a similar thing that you're compelling this baker to speak by making this cake for a same-sex wedding, and that's something that he finds offensive to his religious beliefs and doesn't want to do. What's the difference between these 2 things? And so Ginsburg's dissent is very informative here. It doesn't have any force of law, but she points out the places where she feels that the majority really erred in this decision. And she said there's really no comparison between these two things. It's very clear when you're asking somebody to write a message on a cake, it's hard to distinguish the speech of the person who's requesting that from the speech of the person who's being asked to make it. In the case of the cake, kind of the argument is we don't know what was going to be on that cake because there was no conversation about what was going to be on that cake. So how can you say that this person was forced to express something that they didn't want to express when there was no conversation about what the cake was going to be?
They didn't get in the door.
They may have gotten in the door, but they were very quickly back out of it.
They didn't open the flower, cracking eggs, or anything.
Nothing like that.
Like that. Okay.
Yeah. So,
I wanted to point out that because, well, I know in our previous discussion you mentioned how this case had its bearing on the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And maybe you might want to take this, flesh it out for the audience in our last 5 minutes here.
Yeah. So when we talk about the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the first thing that comes to people's mind is the struggle of people of color to have their rights really recognized and put into force, particularly in the context of getting rid of segregation and voting rights. And there have been a number of amendments to this act in the years intervening. But there's one section that's Title II that covers discrimination in public accommodations. And so a public accommodation applies to many types of businesses, a bakery being one of them. And so the thing that I find very concerning here, and this is from things that I have seen people debate online, is there seems to be this growing movement that they would frame their arguments as being a liberty interest, but my question is
private property rights.
My question is whose liberty are we talking about here? But they believe they should be able to discriminate against anyone for any reason and not have to justify it. But that's not what the law is. That's not what the law requires. And so I see this as one piece of the pursuit of that goal that these people have. And my question is, what kind of a society do you want to have? Do you want to have a cooperative society where people are able to live in relative peace with each other despite their differences? And some of those differences can be very strong. But we want to basically have a society where everyone has a chance to thrive and to prosper.
I think that the 1964 Civil Rights Act has been a kind of a bone of contention with a lot of libertarians that it might not be politically correct to talk about, but they, again, like I said, a bone of contention. And I remember when Rand Paul, when he first was elected senator from Kentucky, in one of his first interviews, he got into trouble with it because he questioned some of the logic behind it, and then he tried to walk. He tried to by saying exactly what was on his mind. He tried to say he was hijacked, for example, gotcha questions and such. And
it's not really a gotcha question.
Yeah.
You walk right into the wall. You know?
Yeah. But he refused to do interviews for about 6 months till it blew over. But that's, I mean, so when you mention that, I know about that community out there that has issues with that, and that doesn't have sexual orientation in it.
It does not.
Right.
Yeah. There are no federal protections for sexual orientation or any of the gender, sexual, and romantic minorities.
Hence the importance of this case, or why everyone was looking at it.
Yeah. And so in Colorado, they do actually have state laws that protect sexual orientation. And so kind of the argument that people on the opposite side say is that, you're talking about fundamental rights. Fundamental rights should always be the thing that triumphs. But that's not actually how it works. The court is very careful when it comes to anything that infringes or potentially infringes on a fundamental right, such as those of speech or religious belief and practice, religious expression. But those rights are not absolute. And the classic examples are, you can't go into a theater, crowded theater, and yell fire and create a panic and endanger the lives of people. So there are obvious limits to speech. Where are the limits to religion? Those are maybe a little bit more murky. The one that comes to mind is there was a case where some people sued because they wanted to use peyote in their religious religious rites, and they were denied because of peyote being illegal, and they were basically told, no, your rights do not triumph over this particular kind of law. And kind of the way the court describes this is if it's a generally applicable law and it's applied neutrally so that you aren't disfavoring someone necessarily because of their religion. So the court is very careful. They apply very strict scrutiny very often to these cases.
Yeah. I was thinking of, I know you mentioned the Arizona case, but we're about to wrap up on time. What's the landscape once the next time? There was a lot of disappointment with this decision because it didn't, it left a lot of ambiguity. When's the next opportunity for some clarity, do you think, or is that on the horizon? Or?
Well, that's a good question. It really depends on what cases will make their way up to the Supreme Court and then which cases the court will agree to take, because they don't take just any case.
But nothing's set on the horizon, right?
Nothing's set on the horizon right now. There are glimmers of hope. You mentioned the Arizona case, which actually cited this case, but went the other way and went in favor of the same-sex couples there.
What was that Arizona case again?
That was a case of brush and nib.
Can you spell that, or just
Brush, B-R-U-S-H, and nib, N-I-B.
Okay. And if they Google that, they can pull that.
Yeah, they can find that. And it's another case where there was nothing ever said about what specifically they wanted created, and these people were just immediately discriminated against.
Okay, go ahead. Because I interrupted you, but what did you want to include?
So the court, it's very hard sometimes to read the tea leaves when it comes to the court as to what they're really doing. The case is the case, and it really just applies here to this baker. But there are things that were said in the ruling that reaffirmed the rights of gay and lesbian couples, LGBT people. And so there is some hope that they're leaving some room open for a future case to come along and maybe decide this issue. The court's job really is to resolve these controversies of law. And so they will really be looking for a case that is very fitting and I think very clear. And maybe they felt this one was a bit murky because of some of the things the commission said to Jack Phillips. So.
Okay. Well, thanks, Stephen. And you mentioned earlier, I'm going to ask about the acronyms, the different acronyms that are popular. The Spectrum or Spectrum.
Spectrum Center at the University of Michigan.
The Spectrum Center. They can Google that.
Yeah.
I guess find that to try to keep up to date and understand what's the common terminology and what's in use. And follow Supreme Court cases. SCOTUS, SCOTUS. Just Google that. I believe it's SCOTUS.com.
I think it might be SCOTUS.org.
.org. Okay, that'll pop up. Thanks, Stephen. Anything else you want to add before we say goodbye to everybody?
I guess just one thing that kind of worries me is when we think about discrimination in terms of religion, we're usually talking about something that prevents somebody from being able to worship or express their beliefs. And what I see here with these moves, like the Masterpiece Cake Shop thing, is it almost seems like they're flipping the script and saying, well, I'm infringed if I can't discriminate against other people. And there's just something that seems very wrong to me about that. So,
I agree. And Civil Rights Commission, which Hopefully, it says you can't discriminate against sexual orientation agrees too. So, thank you, Stephen, for showing up. Thank you guys for tuning in, and please check us out on the Alex Thomas Show next week at 7 o'clock here at the Riverside Arts Center, 76 North Huron. Bye bye.